Okay, hello everyone. Good evening. My name is Andrew Blustein I'm the Vice Chair of Garfunkel Wild, and I'm here to present, actually to moderate, a presentation that's given by Roy Bejarano for the Medical Society of the State of New York. And the topic, which we got a lot of good feedback on, is how to maximize success and maintain control and ownership of your physician group. We are very excited to present this tonight. A recording of this webinar will be made, and a copy of the presentation will be sent to those people who are logging on. You can ask questions. You don't have to worry. The questions will be anonymous. Only Roy and I can see them. But you shouldn't wait till the end, because if we're getting a lot of questions, we'll leave more than the allotted 15 minutes that we have now allotted to take those questions. We have already gotten some questions that people wanted us to consider, and we will consider them. So with that, I'm going to do some brief introductions and then turn it over to Roy. So as you'll hear, Roy is the co-founder and CEO of Scale Physician Group. He's going to take you through 5 different aspects in his presentation: the benefits of practice consolidation, common barriers to building sustainable growth, maximizing the success of your platform, tips for developing a competitive advantage, and enter a private equity transaction with confidence. And then, as I said, we will take those questions. So really big thank you to the New York State Medical Society. Garfunkel Wild is very pleased to be counsel to the Medical Society, and we appreciate all the input that we get from members and all the questions that we can take. As part of your membership benefit, there is a certain access to us that is not chargeable. Now, Scale Physician Group provides non-clinical advisory and management services to independent and private equity-owned physicians, which means, in my humble opinion, that they present a platform to be able to help physician groups in this ever-changing environment. And Roy Bejarano is the co-founder with Jason Schiffman of Scale, and they have helped a lot of physicians, as you can see from this slide. I have known Roy for many, many years. Besides being very smart, you'll hear he has a great accent. And he has worked in the financial industry prior to working in healthcare. He's an investment banker at Salomon Smith Barney, Citigroup, and Houlihan Lokey. But I met Roy when he co-founded and was the president of Frontier Healthcare, and they became the largest ASC management company in New York, and then they sold to Physicians Endoscopy, and he served after that as Chief Strategy Officer and co-president for the Physicians Endoscopy MSO initiative. And then he went on to found Scale, and it has taken off for reasons that you can ask him about, but it seems like a kind of novel approach to helping groups remain independent. That's why I think he's an excellent speaker for tonight. And he speaks very often, and you'll see why in 10 seconds, because he's extremely articulate. So with that, I will turn it over to Roy, and you'll hear back from me when we get closer to the question and answer period. Roy, all yours.
Thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate that. I just hope that, given that this is going to be recorded, we get the chance to edit me just in case I slip up over the next hour. But with that said, I'm going to dive in and hope for the best. So for everyone who's listening, we look forward to receiving your questions and maybe to meeting you in person to expand on some of the ideas that we're going to share this evening. So the benefits of practice consolidation, we're going to go through the agenda, and we're going to start with some very basic positions, views, opinions that we have in order to create a building block of logic that we want to transfer to you over the next hour. And it's really these basic rules that we hope that you take with you. I don't expect you to memorize an hour's worth of discussion and Q&A, but I do hope that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 takeaways that you can carry with you from week to week, month to month, year to year, as you navigate through your respective practice and all the different challenges and opportunities that it's going to face. It's sort of similar to reading a great book. I do a lot of reading, and I always bring up books that I've read, in the past week, past month, and past lifetime. And it's funny, I always think about the 1, 2, or 3 most important lessons that I took away from a great book. So I'm hoping that we can emulate that. So lesson number 1 is, and someday I hope to debate it with you in person, from our viewpoint, scale is a good thing for platforms up and to an extent. And that extent we've yet to really fully appreciate. We're starting as an industry in what I would call a cottage state, which is really a strange adjective to use in the year 2019. But really, if you look at healthcare and compare it to other industries in this country, it is a lot more fragmented. It has far more numerous entities. By example, New York, I believe the most populous business in New York is physician practices, more so than law firms, more so than accounting firms, hairdressers, petrol stations. You have 40+ thousand practices in New York alone. It's a massive number. And then imagine the rest of the country is generating similar type numbers. You've got a lot of onesie, twosie practices that are out there amongst the 750,000 active providers that are still in the U.S. today. That's a lot of business. Compare that to something like the savings and loans industry that went from a massive 50,000 entities down to 30,000, down to today somewhere between, I don't remember the last time I studied this, but somewhere between 2,000 and 7,000 entities. It just gives you a sense of scale, how many different physician practices are truly out there. The numbers are absolutely staggering. And all of that made sense as long as healthcare was opaque. Healthcare as an industry functioned within a black box. And in that black box, you had great doctors doing wonderful things, very customized, bespoke medicine, very research-driven, progressive medicine, very customer-friendly, patient-friendly medicine. But you also had a lot of practices that functioned in opaqueness and suffered as a result. They didn't know what best practice was. They didn't have the opportunity to really understand how to develop payer relationships. They really didn't develop the greatest IT and data for their patient charts. They missed a lot of opportunities. And so where we are today, we're in an industry that is reacting to and promoting consolidation for a whole host of reasons. And as that industry is transitioning from highly fragmented to less fragmented to consolidated, you're seeing a lot of the benefits of scale that, frankly, other industries have experienced being transferred over to the healthcare industry and to providers and to their patients. What we have here in our first slide is an example of the before and after. It's almost like looking at an ad for a plastic surgeon. This is your face before and this is your face after. It's very simplistic, and obviously platforms and practices are a lot more complex than this. But really, the point that's being made here is today you might be part of a practice. Tomorrow you might be part of a platform. What are the differences between A and B? From my viewpoint, and I don't know that there's a scientific strict answer to this, a practice is probably a single location, a limited number of providers, very limited number of in-house managers, heavily focused on patient care, but not necessarily focused on all the different verticals that can fall within the broader definition of a healthcare delivery system, a healthcare delivery business. Whereas a platform has truly adopted the concept that management and healthcare are interchangeable. They belong together. The clinical side of healthcare is its own discipline, requiring of specialists with deep expertise. The management side of healthcare is its own discipline, requiring of specialists with their own expertise. And so as you transition into the platform space, you start to see things like C-suite executives, CSOs, CMOs, CROs, CEOs, COOs. You start to see different layers of management. You start to see division heads. You start to see an ever-growing number of full-time equivalents. You start to see a corporate headquarters. You start to see multiple locations. You start to see growing complexity. The reality of scale is that it's both good and bad because of its strange and peculiar relationship with the word complexity. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail as we go further down this presentation. Common barriers to sustainable growth. Here are some of the questions that we hear providers asking on a regular basis. How do I solve for the expertise that I need and all the technical issues that I face as I'm trying to grow my business? This is one of the great ironies of growing any business. And I see that every day, and I lived through it as I grew my MSO to plus 100 FTEs servicing 150 providers. It takes an expert to hire an expert. And as a CEO, that's a very frustrating reality to live in because no one CEO is an expert in all of his or her domains. I had to hire a head of RCM. My billing business ended up collecting $200 million. And I was never a billing expert myself. I didn't spend the 25 years painstakingly evaluating posting and collections and benefits and verifications and all the different departments that fall within RCM to be able to assess whether my head of billing candidates were truly excellent or at least appeared excellent on their resume. And so this challenge of how to hire without having the expertise already in-house to assess who it is that I'm hiring is very real, very acute, and very concerning because we are all making very big bets about these managers that we bring into our businesses. One of the offerings that we provide at scale is a family of pre-existing experts who are there to offer advice in the process of hiring. And one of the interesting things that we see when we get involved in platforms is that actually hiring, full-time hiring goes up immediately. Because you can imagine there's pent-up demand from seasoned full-time operators to bring in experts, and what held that or prevented that from manifesting was the insecurity about who to bring in. So we address some of that insecurity with our own added expertise. Another question is, how do I find time to architect a complex business within a very difficult, changing, dynamic environment, given that I'm busy treating my patients all the time. For those practices that have really started to evolve into platforms, this answer has been self-evident. You need more than yourself. Platforms can't be run exclusively by clinicians. They need administrators, they need managers. What we do find and what we do promote is as much clinical and clinician involvement as possible. Frankly, every business benefits when everyone involved in the business is as involved as possible, from janitors to CEOs. So the idea that physicians who represent the greatest amount of value, both in the upside and on the downside, should be asked to just focus over there and take as little interest as possible in what's happening over here is something that I've always objected to. I think creating options for providers to be able to focus exclusively on their patients is a good thing, but always creating a welcoming environment where physicians, no matter how large the organization, are taking a front and center role in terms of leadership, front and center in terms of transparency and access to information, and front and center as much as possible in terms of ownership. These are all very positive things. Another question that's been asked, how do I gain access to limited best practice intellectual property from provider platforms across the country? So this is sort of a rather technical way of saying, how do I make sure that my practice or my platform in my part of the world is as well informed as possible? And I think the point I would make there is the providers that I've worked with over the past decade, many of whom are in New York, do a great job of attending conferences, listening to some of their peers discuss clinical developments and business-related developments. And they use those conferences to really share knowledge and gain knowledge. And I welcome that. I think that's a wonderful use of time. I just would ask that as we're building these platforms, you pay attention and keep your ear open for the many other disciplines that fall within reconnaissance, the art of corporate development, the art of knowledge gathering within the world of corporate America. And as you build these platforms, you recognize that you are becoming to some extent part of corporate America. So what do I mean by that? Corporate development involves spending time with other C-suite executives of other companies. It involves working with intermediaries, not just bankers and not just lawyers, but third-party experts. It involves doing research and building your own analytics team. One of the things that we see at scale that we facilitate is not just the heavy use of our analysts, and it's really the thing that I've invested in the most early, which is a deep bench of just pure analysts that just run numbers and develop reports. But what we also see a growing awareness amongst our providers and our platforms that they need to develop their own analysts, and we're there to help them do that. So just the idea that you are actually in the business of gathering intellectual capital, not just clinical intellectual capital, but business intellectual capital. What techniques are working in Southern Florida versus Washington State versus California, and how can I take those lessons learned and bring them into my platform in Westchester is actually time well spent. It's a lot of work, but there's a lot of value in that knowledge and in those relationships built. How do I evaluate a private equity transaction with limited private equity experience? The answer is don't. Private equity transactions are incredibly complex. They represent significant upside. They also represent significant downside. There's a lot of anecdotal information available from individuals who've sold to private equity. I'm one of those people. I sold my business to a $3.5 billion fund. But what you hear on the phone in a 5-minute conversation about an asset that was sold and the reality are very different. The reality of doing a deal with private equity is that there's a lot of complexity that resides in many different aspects of a private equity transaction. We'll touch on some of those elements tonight. But the most important element, and this brings me back to the first thing I was saying, which is rules that you take away from this evening, is that private equity is not something you suddenly jump into because the timing is advantageous. Private equity is a skill set and a journey and a path that you want to try to leverage other people who've been doing this for years, decades, in order to assist you, in order to make sure that as you take that path, you're doing it incredibly intelligently. One of the key reasons why private equity transactions are acutely dangerous, despite all the upside, is that they invariably come with an enormous amount of debt. And for most of the platforms and the practices that I've grown up with, the idea that physician earnings would be levered or leveraged 5, 4, 6, 7 times, and that debt would sit on the balance sheet is a transformational change from the way that providers are used to performing their business or used to engaging in daily activities. The idea that that debt has no impact on your business or your life on a professional level, on a personal level, is not realistic. And we can spend time on that during the rest of this phone call. We can spend time with that after this phone call. That's just one small example of how transformational a private equity deal is. What are the changes that I need to invest in order to not be left behind? And what should I be wary of? Well, just asking that question is a very healthy step in itself. The idea that there is such a reality that we face where some practices, some providers are being left behind, some are not, is healthy because the pursuit of knowledge, expertise, and the realization that change is upon us is in some respects the healthiest step that you can take in order to ensure that you're not left behind. I'm moving on, maximizing the success of your platform. And by the way, Andrew, please interrupt me at any point. You know how I get bored at the sound of my own voice, so I would welcome the interruption. So to maximize the success of your platform, you really want to do certain things really well. In no particular order, but these are all self-reinforcing in a sort of circular pattern. You want a lot of strong leadership, and I'm stating the obvious, but saying strong leadership and actually cultivating, reinforcing, protecting, and investing in strong leadership are two very different things. Effective and transparent operations. We blog repeatedly on our website. This would be another key takeaway that I would offer all of you from tonight's call. If you can take an active interest in our website, which is scalephysiciangroup.com or scale-pg.com, either work, you'll see in our blog section that we blog every 2 or 3 weeks. And we blog on purpose to try to share our knowledge with as many providers as possible. Our goal is to try to share our knowledge with 1 million providers by the end of next year. We're a little ambitious, but we have a whole set of reasons to believe that we'll be a long way there. And the reason why we want to share as much of our lessons learned as we go along is because we actually are of the strong belief that we're all better off if the industry as a whole performs better. And we form that view because A, the industry, we can't think of any industry that's more important to the well-being of this country. And B, we're under an enormous microscope. So A is at risk from B. And both point to the idea that we should all be actually trying to compete in a very collaborative way. And there is a way to do that. We think one of the ways to do that is to share knowledge as much as possible. So these blogs speak to the lessons learned. In terms of effective and transparent operations, we talk about the cadence and the frequency of meetings, the quality of what's taking place in these meetings, the role that C-suite managers should take actually auditing what's going on in their business operations. So communication within a business environment is critical. Very easy to get wrong, very easy to get right and then get wrong. One of the many aspects of a platform that requires constant vigilance. Enhanced service and improved patient outcomes. Certainly the idea that we want to focus on every aspect of our platform and ensure that it's performing at the highest level. Establishing rules, benchmarking against those rules, and correcting for those rules. What we often see is that platforms monitor some of their performance. They don't monitor all of it. And if they monitor performance, they don't necessarily monitor their response to subpar performance. So you cannot overstate how much oversight, analytics, reporting, clarity in reporting needs to take place within an organization. When we called ourselves Scale, we didn't just think about scale by way of adding more providers. We thought of scale the way that scale is achieved throughout our environment, which is really through systems. And so even communication within an organization should be systematic. Andrew, that's you.
Yeah, that actually was my alarm timing to jump in for a second. Let me ask you a question, Roy. Well, no, go back to the one you just were at.
Yeah.
So the questions are lighting up, and by the way, everyone, we won't be able to get to these many, but keep entering them. But my question, my question to you is, looking at this slide. One of the things that the Medical Society prides itself on is they have, and people are asking questions about it, they have solo practitioners, and then they have groups that are very large, okay? So I think looking at this slide, depending on, let's take both extremes. Let's take a 20-person multi-specialty group, and let's take a solo practitioner. Let's take a solo practitioner first, okay? I can barely keep my head above water. I'm running around. I'm dying. Okay.
Yeah.
It's great to talk about analytics. I can barely get my payroll company. My billing company to send out. What do I do to them? And then the same question now for the 20-person multi-specialty group.
So. I don't know that in a hypothetical I can solve any set of problems that a one-man operation might face, being overwhelmed with too many patients and not enough infrastructure. But I'll take a crack at it and then work my way back to the larger multi-specialty. Many of the rules that we promoted based on decades worth of experience. I myself have in one way or another been exposed to maybe 3,500 private companies and management teams. 12 years of investment banking and being a very active and busy banker will do that for you. And running my own boutique advisory shop, working with 450 relatively distressed companies, which is what you typically see when you're a young boutique, as opposed to a Goldman Sachs. And then working with providers over the last decade, you start to, and then building a business, obviously, in healthcare, and then running a much larger version of that business on a national scale. You look for as many correlations with success and failure as you can find, and you start to form as many golden rules as you can get away with. And what you see is a lot of those rules are just as applicable in a two-man practice as they are in a 250-man practice, or even if now we're getting to the stage where we're starting to see 500 provider platforms. And a lot of those rules are broken in every one of those types of businesses. And actually, in some respects, things get harder to maintain as you get larger. Some of the diseconomies of scale that also exist. So what are those rules that I would offer the two-man practice? One is recognize that just like Isaac Adidjas would write in his book about management, it takes 4 different types of managers to run a good organization, and very rarely does any one person have all 4 of those disciplines. The person who's wonderful at making cakes isn't necessarily going to be enough to ensure that the person making cakes feels good about the fact that they're running their own cake shop and working till 3 o'clock in the morning every night just to make ends meet. So just because you're very good at making the cakes doesn't mean that the business is getting everything it needs to reach a level of equilibrium and stability. And so I would advise the two-man practice to try to find the time to think about something other than patient care and getting by. And then if you find that time, start to ask questions like, where do I create capacity for myself and for my company to be able to focus on what comes next? How can I start to delegate some of this work elsewhere, which is to some extent an investment question, an investment of time, training. If you have your own front-end staff, are they competent, and do they show an ability, a desire to maybe take on some responsibility? If they don't, is there a young 20-year-old post-college grad who is looking for their first job and an opportunity to make a difference? Who can you bring into your organization to try to remove some of the non-clinical pressure away from you? Without that time spent by leadership to try to make some informed decisions, all I can offer you is status quo. And in healthcare, status quo is actually another way of moving backwards. If you can use that time to make small investments, smart, low-risk investments in the beginnings of infrastructure, staying away from the most complex decisions, and not necessarily focusing on more growth, I think you'll start to see some modicum of improvement. If you can start to not only add junior resources, but have access to senior expertise as you start to make these decisions, then you'll obviously benefit from those who have done this before you. That expertise may come from your peers, physicians across the street who have faced the same problems and dealt with them. It may come from your accountant. It may come from Scale. It may come from Andrew. But there are many people who have dealt with, the realities of being tiny and overwhelmed. It's a reality that every entrepreneur faces, at least during their first few years of operation.
So Roy, let me ask a question about the person across the street. I'm the small practice, or maybe even the medium practice. The guy across the street has been my competitor. We see each other at meetings. But if you're right about what you said about that author, that it takes more than one kind of manager to make it successful, should I maybe be reaching out across the street to my competitor for the last few years and think about getting together in some way so that we can support each other in these difficult times?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've grown up in a world, in a country, and in a neighborhood where we were taught to fear our competitors and stay away from them and be as introverted as possible about our business and then hope for the best. My world changed when I worked for the former head of UBS Americas, founder of Dillon Reed, one of the most respected bankers in the street. named Bob Holtz at Houlihan Lokey, who was the chairman of Houlihan. He still is. And I purposely asked or ensured that I could work for him directly as opposed to leaving early, just so I could learn lessons like, what does someone like that do with their time? And the funny thing is that I learned very quickly is that they spend half their time at lunches with other CEOs of large investment banks like Goldman Sachs and Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley, talking shop. And that is just priceless. So if there's another golden rule that I would ask the providers on this phone to take with them is open your kimonos and horse trade in information. Now, what was it like hiring that head of billing? What was it like when you spent that large amount? I noticed that you were promoting through direct marketing to patients. It looks really successful. Did it work for you? Oh, it was a complete failure. Don't ever do that. What a waste of money. Okay, you've just saved yourself a year of headache. In return, that individual will ask you, I just always appreciate how happy your patients are when they get the following type of procedure. Why is it that you do such a better job than I do making your patients happy? I mean, I'm just rambling on, but that's just the nature of some of these discussions. I would say for a CEO of a large organization, you spend more and more of your time doing that than you do worrying about holding on to every last secret. There is information that you don't share, no doubt about it, the sensitive information. But if you really think about it, it's a much smaller list than what you might assume.
So what you're saying is that in these choppy waters, we have to be willing to ask questions to people we normally wouldn't have, but that also means sharing. So you just said, but I think there's a reluctance to do that, but I hear it. What are the things that you started to say, but you didn't elaborate, that I should not share? So now I've gone out to dinner with my competitor. I found out that he's got a really good marketing person that he outsourced. I'm going to do that. But now he's trying to ask me questions. When should I ask for the check? When are we oversharing?
Yeah, so, the reality is someone who's truly trustworthy, who is a gentleman in the way they conduct themselves, will never poach your talent, will always give you an honest answer. Someone who's been tested for many years, slowly and gradually, is someone that you can share a great deal with. Someone who you're having your first date with, who you haven't reference checked, you don't know their background, you're not necessarily that comfortable, is someone that you should take a long time with before you engage in these kinds of discussions. I'm not going to suggest that there's any one topic that you don't necessarily want to go into too much detail with. I think it's case specific, but I think I would suggest that it really depends on who you're speaking to, and I think that everyone on this phone call knows this. My only point in emphasizing it is that it's a good thing, and I promote more of it, not less.
Okay, keep going. I took you off your swing, but this slide shows.
So let's talk about the 20 provider platform or the 200 provider platform. The large organization with a growing body of FTEs, 3 FTEs, 4 FTEs, 5 FTEs for every provider. 100 providers, it has 500 full-time equivalents. Let's talk about that organization. And none of this is sponsor-owned yet. So an organization like that, what are some of the challenges, Andrew, that you'd like me to address? We see so many of them. Where would you like me to focus?
The most common ones.
The most common ones. So look, the difference between private equity and non-private equity owned is independent platforms. They may feel like they're under duress and need to move quickly in order to do a private equity transaction. And to some extent, that is true. A realization that we reached, Jason and I, while we worked in our last national organization, was that competitors were emerging very quickly, and they were gaining size very rapidly in an industry that for 20, 30 years while we had been there was used to moving far more slowly. So I can understand independent platforms feeling pressure, but that's a different kind of pressure than being owned by a sponsor, a private equity group that is under enormous pressure to sell you within 3 to 5 years' time, given the nature of how you measure return on equity investments. So for independent large platforms, some of the issues that we see are somewhat built management teams that are really a reflection of the knowledge that providers brought to the table based on their experience to date. And then as a result, we see heavily underdeveloped divisions or departments, disciplines within platforms that are painfully necessary. And so it's very common for us to see a strong billing department and a very weak marketing department, a strong marketing department and a very weak IT and data department. Where we spend our time blogging and writing is on some of the very basics, like how should you even think about IT within a large physician organization? Where we start is typically IT is a 5-man group that's busy fixing computers and phones. Where we end up is IT and data should be a board seat. Your CIO is one of the most important voices that you can listen to pretty much every decision you make. And then the response is, well, where do I get a CIO? And so just entire divisions could be missing. The word sales as a concept and attaching to that business and corporate development is a very common oversight. The idea that large provider businesses should be engaged in best practice in sales is a novelty. But when you really think about it, selling to your next round of providers, selling to your next group of strategic partners, selling directly to patients, selling to your next acquirer. There's a lot of selling that's going on. Something that I dealt with when we were a national MSO. We had a 6-man sales team, and you need a lot of leadership there. Developing multiple layers of leadership. So a lot of platforms are built around 1, 2, 3, 4 really talented providers and or managers. But transitioning that to not just tremendous strength and talent at the board level and C-suite level, but a business that's really in the business of training juniors to rise up. Very hard thing to do, but a very necessary thing to do, because otherwise we end up talking to an echo chamber where behind closed doors we make a lot of sense, but out there in your 25th practice location, no one's listening to us. So these are just some examples. I think holding true to the presentation, trying to get through as many of these slides as possible, I think I'm going to speed it up a little bit. Slide 12 speaks to the various ways that we go about analyzing information. One at a board level, very high level, 30,000 foot analysis and solutions. Then replicating the systematic approach down at a more granular level. How do our operators in the field take what we're building for them at the executive level and replicate it and drive our values and our rules, parameters, constraints into the organization throughout. And then the loop mechanism, how do we take the lessons that we're learning, what's working, what's not working, bring it to the next location, bring it to the right full set of regional heads, bring it all the way up to the board, and then react to it as opposed to seeing it disappear down a vacuum. So these are complex things that really ultimately determine success and failure as businesses get ever larger. And we read about these failures in the newspaper, right? When Bank of America has a problem in North Carolina or some other state where executives are engaged in stuff they shouldn't have been, that's because this slide failed. There weren't enough controls, there wasn't enough oversight, and FTEs got the wrong idea and did the wrong stuff. So the pressure on us to build and build and build, scale and infrastructure grows and grows and grows. But there is no other way to achieve real sustainable scalability. I'm going to keep going. Necessary areas of focus to successfully achieve scale. So one area that I haven't touched on yet is, who do you want to be? What is your plan, your map, that just like Columbus, you're trying to make good on in order to get to the other side? And what we often see, Andrew, even in large organizations, is maybe it got a little bit dusty, or maybe they just haven't had that conversation in a long time, but a combination of, a reluctance to commit to who are we and why are we, the big questions, and too much dust gathered between now and the last time that a 5-year business plan was really opined on and signed off on by all the necessary voices. And I'm a big believer that, with all the attention that we give to monthly variance and annual budgets, we should give just as much attention to what our 5-year business plan is and correct for it as we learn more and more. One of the things that we learn is what we're doing well to achieve it and what we're failing at to achieve it. What's taking too long, what's proving to be too expensive, far too difficult. But just because something is taking too long doesn't mean we can't take corrective action. And so that 5-year business plan becomes our reality very quickly. We all on this phone know how quickly 5 years manifests. And then we are there. We are where we either prepared to be or didn't prepare to be, but that becomes our reality.
Roy, let me jump in for 1 second. I'm going to guess that almost none of the, maybe one or two of the groups that are represented on this call have a business plan. This is the guess. If people want to write and say I'm wrong, that won't be the first time today. So, but my question to you is, if somebody's listening to saying, okay, I get it, I need a business plan, but can you tick off like the top things that go into a business plan? Like what am I supposed to stick in there?
Yeah. So I like to simplify things. I think you do too, which is why you and I get asked to do a lot of talking. Because I don't really have a choice when it comes to simplifying. That's just as far as my mind will go. So a business plan I might have developed, given different iterations, at least 5,000 of them. And I'm sure that's understating it grossly. So, I know a thing or two about them. And I will simplify it all down to 1 or 2 sentences, which is essentially, it's a commitment to agreeing to what you want to do versus what you don't want to do. And that discipline is very important. There's a lot of, I'll stick to providers and businesses that miss the opportunity of committing to something and then going out and executing it. I'll use an example. I saw a podiatrist recently, and my feet were hurting with me, and I sat down with him. He's a 3-man practice in Manhattan with 2 more locations, one in Brooklyn and one in Queens. And I asked him a question about his business, and he has ambitions. He's young enough; he wants to do more. And I asked him what his business plan was. Are you interested in expanding into musculoskeletal? Are you interested in expanding into pain? Which areas are of interest to you? And a whole slew of ideas came out without necessarily picking one. And that's always a sign that these will remain ideas as opposed to actual actions. A business plan takes those ideas, those possibilities, and we all have many of them. We can all do many things. And in healthcare, actually, our options increase over time as connections between different service lines become more available to us and knowledge becomes more available. But a business plan takes all those options and condenses them into the 1, 2, or 3 that you actually want to commit to in terms of time and resources. And a business plan also at the same time forces you to go through the exercise of rejecting all those service lines, all those initiatives, all those investments that you're not going to commit to. And so in the future, it becomes a little bit easier to not go to that conference on ENT because it's a waste of time, to not hire that provider who's a GI because it doesn't fit in with the path that you committed to. It also forces you into the discipline of why. Why are you going to, over the next 5 years, stick to bariatrics and avoid GI? And it compels you to come up with some very good reasons. And if you find yourself sort of making it up as you go along without real scientific thought attached to it, it's probably a sign that you don't have enough experts in the room. Just like any military campaign and any plan of any kind, you have a plan and then you break it. But I think most campaigners, me being one of them, would strongly argue for always having that plan. Because if you don't, you're just reactive and flapping in the wind. So yeah, I do think it's a good test for everyone on this phone. Do you have a 5-year plan or don't you? Above and beyond, do you have a 1-year budget or don't you? Is that fair?
Yeah, gotcha.
Okay, so more areas to focus on to achieve scale: performance, workflow, structure, best practice, gap analyses. We do all of this, and we promote teaching and training and sharing in the development of all these practices in all the platforms that we get involved in. There is no way to build scale without structure, and I've made that point now. Actual versus target KPIs. How are we doing? That honest discussion. A good management team, a good business is non-compromising on its core values, principles, and goals. And that you see manifested in every last inch of the business. There is no exceptions. We are what we are, and we will not compromise that. And that becomes self-fulfilling success because your identity becomes very clear to all of those around you and inside of you. There's no way to achieve any of that without being honest all the time. Painfully honest, sensitively, but painfully honest. The actual versus target KPIs is a sign that you are being honest. Bad news, good news, nothing should be brushed under when you're in the business of building and competing. Value enhancing opportunities, investment and cost saving opportunities, every opportunity to take that low hanging fruit and build the bridges towards medium and high hanging fruit. Anyone can pick at low hanging fruit. Do you have what it takes to build towards medium and high hanging fruit? That's always an interesting question. The stuff that's 12, 24, 36, and 48 months away. If you're not going to build it, I promise you some other high-quality management team is, and then you're going to have to compete with them 48 months from now. Executive summary analytics. Can you empower your decision makers to A, be in the room, so that you're inviting all the right people and you're not being insular, excessively insular, that actually you're being open-handed and inviting. And two, can you make sure that the quality of these meetings is extremely high and that time is not being wasted? Quality controls, I think that's all embedded in everything else that we've discussed. Tips for developing a competitive advantage, how to differentiate from your competitors. I think there's plenty of room for super high quality, great healthcare provider organizations in this country. I think we're in the beginning stages of building these organizations. So to say that there isn't room for them is nonsense. And I speak from the perspective of knowing one-man practices all over the country and 500-man practices all over the country. There is room for improvement with all of them. There's certainly room for improvement at scale in my organization. So let's compete. The question is, who are you going to be within that competition, within that ecosystem? And it is important to form an identity. So not knowing what's going on around you is a sign that you either A, are not forming your own identity, or if you are, you might be forming the wrong identity. So there's only reasons to gather reconnaissance, as I mentioned earlier. Self-discovery, where are you going and why? Is there truly demand for what you're offering, and is it sustainable? Is it truly special, or is it momentary? Are you taking advantage of some kind of mistake in the market that will be soon correctified, or are you building something that can last the test of time? Flexibility, don't be stuck in the past. I think that's both anecdotal and scientific. So the idea of being objective, unemotional about what you're building, certainly being nostalgic and proud of everything that you have in the past in your rearview mirror, but also being forward-minded, forward-thinking. And I think your younger providers will definitely appreciate that mindset. Treat people individually. Everyone has a life story to tell. I think this is one of the hardest things for large organizations to do because we're so busy on the large end building rule after rule and systematizing and creating uniformity and creating stability and certainty that if we're not careful, we start managing by the averages. And if there's one thing I have to push back on and slow everyone down on as they're busy building large organizations, is that people are not averages. They're individuals. And so it is a lot more effort than it might first appear. With all the data in the world and all the dashboards in the world and all the variances in the world, every one of our healthcare businesses has one thing in common, which is that they're all human capital businesses. They're not machine-based. They're not pure IP-based, software-based. They may be augmented by all these things, but they are primarily people-based businesses, and every individual has his own or her own set of reactions, needs, hopes, expectations. What seems like a fabulous compensation structure to Dr. X is completely exploitative from the perspective of Dr. Y. So one of the themes that I'm always pushing, especially the sponsor community, the private equity community, because they are consistently the least interested in hearing this message, is that if you're not interested in hanging out with doctors, and if you're not interested in interacting with patients, and if you couldn't care less what your front end staff are doing, what your administrators are doing, and you're only hoping to hear about it, arm's length in a corner office, this industry probably isn't for you. And I see that every day. I interact with other executives who have built great businesses within healthcare, not just platforms, but derivatives of platforms like IPAs, ACOs, and I come across managers with all kinds of backgrounds, some of which, are not that sophisticated, and they didn't serve as senior executives at United or Cigna, and yet they've been able to gather, armies of providers to support them in their cause with very little funding. Just amazing businesses that have grown quickly and are doing amazing things. And one of the ingredients that I always look for and I always find in these businesses is the person at the helm is a provider advocate and can speak to the 2,000 providers that are part of his or her network on a first-name basis, hangs out with them night and day, plays golf with them, goes to dinner with them, has lunch with them. That's their world. They're a provider advocate. And so you always have to ask the question, who owns this business and how do they feel about providers? And that's where, different private equity groups have a different answer to you depending on who you're speaking to. Obsess over success in every detail. Cracks become chasms. I can't stress that enough. There really is no room for mistakes and lack of investment when you're growing quickly. Because my business doubled every year for many years. And what I very quickly learned is something that we didn't do well when we were tiny was something that we did heinously badly when we were large. Because growth and scale, it exacerbates whatever your deficiencies are, just like they say that wealth exacerbates the deficiencies of your behavior. Scale exacerbates the deficiencies of your business. And so you really have to be driven by Six Sigma, the sixth derivative of whatever it is that you're doing. And certainly build a team that is capable of doing that. Going back to Adijas, if you are a visionary, if you're a leader, if you're on this phone call because you're a change agent and you can't wait to compete with everyone in this country, someone on your team has to want to stay up at 4 o'clock in the morning solving for, that claim, that billing claim that is 93 days old, and there is no excuse for it. If it's not you, someone on your team has to fit that description. That's why we do these things as teams. Double down on your secret sauce, what is winning and why. I always think about this in the context of sporting analogies. If you're winning because you're a heavyweight boxer and you're 5'6" and just much shorter than all of your opponents, and you have the best uppercut, keep going with that uppercut. Understand why you're winning and invest in why you're winning. If you have a secret sauce, which hopefully you do, invest in it and keep going with it for as long as you can, recognizing that every secret sauce eventually has an expiration date. Eventually, those other heavyweights work it out why you're winning, and they compensate for it. So no advantage, competitive advantage lasts forever. Enter a private equity transaction. Yeah.
Roy, I'm just going to call an audible here. Maybe if you could get through the private equity in like a minute, because there's a lot of questions that I want to get to.
Yeah, so private equity I already touched on repeatedly. My general thesis on private equity, and I work with all of them, more or less, about 120 out of 120 funds. And I've gotten to that point in the 11 months that we've been in business. So you can imagine that it's quite a rapid response from an industry that's not used to giving a crap about newcomers. So my general view of the space is really experienced individuals, very smart, very good people trying to do the right thing. There's a time and place for private equity to marry a provider platform. There's the right private equity partner, not necessarily exclusively the one that's willing to pay you the most. The diligence and sophistication involved in picking who the right partner is complex and deep. But for those that pick right and do so at the right time with the right deal, it can be incredibly empowering and lead to growth in ways that you can only imagine. The number one thing that private equity offers is growth capital in the form of equity. And if you use that very wisely, that can be the difference between being acquired or being the acquirer. The difference between being a state brand, a regional brand, and a national brand. The difference between dictating the future of your space and being dictated to, really having the kind of conversations and relationships with payers that you can only dream of and never achieving that goal. So there's a lot of value in great private equity transactions, but that doesn't mean that it's the right solution or next step for everyone all the time. Common concerns, MSO equity rollover value in 5 years, the second bite. For anyone who's heard that term, Andrew knows my view. It's a nibble, it's not a bite, and we can go into more detail later. Business plan too ambitious. How will a sponsor with limited experience give us confidence? So another of the golden rules, if you're still on the phone and still interested, is please don't do a private equity transaction because you lack expertise in your business and you think that a sponsor or private equity group will provide it for you. That is not the reason to sell a majority interest in your business. And that sort of brings us back all the way to the beginning of this presentation, which is establishing your options. You have many options to build business, and many of them involve a lot of work, effort, expanding your universe of experts, making mistakes. That's the part of building a business that everyone is subjected to. The idea that you don't have those options is a fallacy. And the idea that all those steps will be neatly taken care of for you by a fund that manages $3 billion and invests for a living is also a fallacy. So just wanted to put that point across. What representation do physicians have in an ongoing governance? How do we feel like we're working for a corporation? How do we avoid feeling like we work for a corporation versus a medical practice? So ongoing governance is interesting because to some extent it's guaranteed for you in a practice setting from a clinical perspective, and that's great news. But to some extent that can be a red herring because that can distract from the limited influence that you might actually also want to have in what's happening in your MSO. And so these are much more in-depth conversations, but I would suggest being very aware of what giving up 70% ownership in an MSO that you previously owned 100% of through either the MSO or the PC version of the MSO truly means. A change of control, as Andrew, you will attest, is a change of control from an administrative perspective, and never to be taken lightly. And so a lot of those decisions have to really be thought about. How you avoid feeling like you're working for a corporation. If you own less than 50% and you're majority owned by a third party, please try to make sure that that third party has very similar views, principles, objectives, goals as you. And so even though they may outvote you, they're busy executing on your agenda. And that takes time and diligence. Getting to know a potential buyer well in advance as opposed to an accelerated banquet process is always a good idea. How do you I got to know Physicians Endoscopy 5 years before I did a deal with them, and would meet with management every 6 months to check in, to see if we still got along. Very long process, knowing well in advance that they were a very good buyer for me. It's a very hard thing to do if you're a doctor treating patients, but we can talk about it offline. That's it.
Okay. So, what? No, you went too far, but let me just hit some quick questions. What about the Q&A? Yeah. Well, let me ask some of the ones that happened. A lot of them are coming in about private equity. I take it from your comments that it's not just about getting a big check. You have to choose wisely. But somebody's asking, how does debt hit a practice after the PE deal is commenced?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the reality is the debt will reside in the MSO entity that is the entity through which a transaction takes place. PC entity will see its flow of revenues impacted through the scrape and through an MSO fee agreement. But the real action is taking place at the MSO level from the balance sheet standpoint and from a change of ownership standpoint. And so the debt will reside at the MSO. How does it impact the provider? The provider's distributions from the profit generated by the business will no longer be cleanly repatriated back to that individual provider based on his or her ownership. Instead, they'll be interrupted by this thing called debt amortization, the repayment of debt, because these lenders that are willing to offer 4, 5, 6, 7 times leverage are happy to do so with basic rights embedded into those loan agreements. One of the key rights will be the right to receive repayment of debt ahead of profit distributions. And so from a private equity perspective, there are no distributions until all the debt is paid off. And if you look at an average private equity leverage buyout model, which I've built many of, they're expecting a 3, 4, 5-year debt amortization schedule. So as a provider, you're used to your compensation being a function of your salary base, your bonus, and your profits, and actually experiencing all that cash month to month, quarter to quarter, year to year. A big chunk of that will no longer be finding its way back to your pocket. Instead, it will be going back towards debt repayment. You should also appreciate that from a risk perspective, a highly levered business is a lot more risky than a non-levered business, because a highly levered business no longer has the luxury of having a really weak quarter. If you have a really weak quarter, then you'll find yourself in breach of your covenants, your debt covenants. If you're in breach of your debt covenants, all kinds of things will happen. Cost of debt will come up, controls, restrictions on CapEx will start to manifest, lenders will start to show up and ask all kinds of questions. If you are in repeated breach of your covenants and the debt is no longer supportable by the business, you might find yourself in a position where the lender is in de facto control of the business, superseding the private equity group and you. In that situation, you have to ask yourself, what does the world look like if my business is under the control of a lender workout group that knows little to nothing about healthcare? And so these are the risks, the extent of the risks that you face when you're a highly levered business.
Okay, 3 more questions. We'll do it like speed rounds. And then we'll end at 8:05. We're 5 minutes late. A practice is saying that its income is continually going down due to the referral sources being purchased by local hospitals. I guess they're being purchased and controlled by local hospitals. Is there anything that can be done to slow this trend? Or what should they do in face of this trend, I guess?
Yeah, so there's a lot that can be done. The answer is not nothing. So firstly, competing entities acquiring referring providers is a growing theme. Everyone's interested in referring providers, especially in the context of value-based care. They become more and more valuable with every day that passes because of their influence over spend. So this is something that a lot of provider groups are going to be facing, change in the referral network. Some of the countervailing tactics that can be used are, don't necessarily assume that the hospital is your foe. Try to engage in discussions with that hospital. The hospitals struggle to control what their employed providers are actually referring out to and into. And we deal with that firsthand with some of these hospital systems. So it's not necessarily game over just because they've been acquired. Continue to invest in those referring relationships, and you may find that given the laws of healthcare today, those same employed providers continue to prioritize you over hospital referrals. 2, don't underestimate the power of direct marketing to patients, which should become an ever-growing theme within your business. Excellent marketing, where it's a real strategy and available to you, could give you a lot of independence. 3, diversify your payer Rolodex or your payer strategy. Who else can you develop relationships with that represent a referring base? Is it an IPA? Is it a payer that you've always maintained at an arm's length and now you have a creative new relationship with that payer and they can redirect to you? Is there an independent relationship out there with an ACO that can substitute for that provider base? So I think my general reaction to that is change in your provider mix, in your referring mix, doesn't necessarily mean that you've lost the ability to compete. In most cases, it just means that you have to spend more time thinking about your strategy and your tactics.
Okay, so it's 8:05. I know there's a lot of questions. The questions come up with people's names, so we'll try to reach out to you. If you don't hear from us, you can go and contact Roy or myself. I really want to thank Roy for sharing his incredible knowledge and time. I know you're busy with scale, and I appreciate it. Also appreciate the Medical Society for giving us this opportunity, and we'll keep putting on programs to help members as they go through the ever-changing world of healthcare. So, Roy, thank you, and thank you for everyone who stayed in, and be safe out there. Take care.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate it.